Good evening, everyone. I'm Professor Henrietta Moore. I'm the founder and director of the Institute for Global Prosperity at University College London. It's my pleasure to welcome you all here this evening for the first Directors' Seminar of the academic year. For those of you returning, welcome back. For those who are joining us for the first time, it's a pleasure to see you. Please try to remember that the most important thing that's happening after this very important talk is the welcome party. So please make sure you know how to get there. If you don't know how to get there, follow one of the IGP staff. Now, this term, the Directors' Seminars are on the theme of dreams, desires and aspirations, imaginative landscapes of prosperity. So at the IGP, we're working towards a new model of prosperity for the 21st century, as you all know, reworking the way we conceive and run our economies, our societies, and our relationship with the planet. Our social and collective imaginaries, dreams, and aspirations are at the core of that mission, not only in understanding how people strive towards ideas of prosperity, but in unearthing how and why different ideas of prosperity are constructed in the way that they are. So this term, we are inviting scholars, novelists, politicians, artists, and filmmakers to help us understand some of the imaginary structures that bring prosperity to the place where we find it today, and can allow us to think about where it might go tomorrow. So this evening, I am enormously proud and pleased to introduce to you Chris Smith, Lord Smith of Finsbury. So Chris Smith is an eminent figure in British politics, having enjoyed a long and very memorable career in public service, spanning several decades. And before he became a member of the House of Lords in 2005, he served as Member of Parliament for Islington South and Finsbury. Now, Chris Smith made history shortly thereafter in becoming Britain's first openly gay Member of Parliament. And later, he became a cabinet minister under Tony Blair. And he's been a vocal champion of the LGBT+ community, supporting important legislative reform in a number of significant areas, including equalising the age of consent in Britain, introducing civil partnerships, and scrapping some of the most controversial of the UK's anti-gay laws, known as Section 28. Since then, he's gone on to a number of other prominent leadership roles, including as chairman of the Environment Agency in 2008, and most recently as Master of Pembroke College, Cambridge, which he's just about to step down from. Now, Chris Smith is going to talk to us about lessons for equality and diversity learned from a lifetime in politics and public life. He'll tell the story of how he became an MP, how he became the first openly gay cabinet minister anywhere in the world, and how the struggles to secure equality for LGBT+ people continue to this day right around the world. And he'll tell us a little bit about the necessity for equality, about the need for pride in difference, and about the fulfilment that can come from everybody everywhere being able to be themselves. So please join me in welcoming Chris Smith to the IGP.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Henrietta. I have to say that was rather better as an introduction than I had recently at a big dinner I was speaking at, and after the coffee had been served, the chair of the event turned to me and said, "Do you want to speak now, or shall we let them carry on enjoying themselves for a while?" It's a huge pleasure to be here today, and I wanted to reflect on the very simple fact that in any organisation or business or family or neighbourhood, if someone doesn't feel completely safe and fulfilled about being themselves, that will not be a successful organisation or company or family. And that is why pride in who you are is crucially important for any notion of global prosperity. Let me tell you a bit about my own journey on this road. I was first elected as a Labour Member of Parliament for Islington South and Finsbury in 1983. These are days of prehistory for everyone else in this room. But I had never made any particular secret of the fact that I was gay. But I had never stood up on a public platform and talked about it. And I can remember having a conversation with my agent, who was a lovely woman called Liz, and she was very worried what would happen if I was speaking at a public meeting and someone had shouted out from the audience, we don't want to hear from him, he's gay. And she was all for having a burly working class member of the party standing on the side of the hall, ready to leap in and say, we're not interested in that, we want to hear what he thinks about unemployment. And I remember saying to her, no, if this issue comes up, there is only one possible response. And that is for me to say, yes, I am, so what? Next question, please. It was never raised during the election campaign. I was elected. I was elected just. I had a majority of 363 votes. I took my seat in Parliament, and I thought to myself, at some point, I want to say something publicly about who and what I am. There was a Labour colleague who was gay. He had never come out. He never ever did. But he had journalists following him everywhere. They were camping in cars outside his flat all night. They were rummaging through his dustbins. They were following him wherever he went around Europe. And I just thought the only way of removing the story is to tell it yourself. And so I was determined that at some point I was going to speak out about this. The only question was when and what the right opportunity was going to be. Roll on for about a year, and the city of Rugby in the West Midlands had just changed political control of the council. And the incoming Tory leader of the council had basically said he did not want to have LGBT people coming to work for Rugby Council. He was going to remove sexual orientation from the list of things that the council would not discriminate against in its employment policy. A lot of people were really upset about this, and there was a big march and rally called for the centre of Rugby on a Saturday lunchtime, and they asked me to go up and speak because I said supportive things about LGBT plus rights at that time. And I can remember sitting on the train going up to Rugby and writing this very boring speech. And Then I arrived in the hall where the meeting was taking place, and there were about 1,000 people in the room. And I can remember the meeting had already started, and I can remember walking up through the body of the meeting to take my place on the platform. And that was the moment when I thought, this is the place and the moment to do it. The next 10 minutes before I actually stood up to speak, I have to say, were some of the scariest moments of my life, because no one had ever done this before. My turn came to speak. Oh, and I had thought the reason why this was the right place to do it, because the issue in rugby was the ability of anyone, no matter what their sexual orientation happened to be, to do an equally good job as anyone else working for Rugby Council. That was the issue at stake. And I just thought, actually, exactly the same applies to MPs. And so my turn came to speak, and I stood up and I began my speech by saying, my name is Chris Smith, I'm the Labour MP for Islington South and Finsbury, and I'm gay. And at that point, the entire hall got to its feet and gave me a standing ovation. It's the only standing ovation I've ever had half a minute into a speech. But I have to say, I have never regretted that moment for a single instant ever since. In the following week, I got letters from people all around the country. There was no social media in those days, so you got letters. And I still have them, a huge pile. And some of them said, good on you, well done, congratulations. But the letters which meant the most were the ones that said, thank you, what you have done has made it easier for me. And if by saying something publicly about myself, I was able to give just one or two people a little bit of extra confidence and pride in themselves, then it will have been worth it. I was the only openly gay MP for the following 9 years. Now the place is heaving with them. But it is the gayest legislature anywhere in the world. But in those days, it was quite a lonely existence. We were also in the midst of fighting all sorts of homophobic legislation, including Section 28, which Henrietta referred to. I remember lots of debates about Section 28. There was one moment, there was a particularly Neanderthal Tory who was making a speech about Section 28, and I stood up to intervene on him, and I made a point, and as I was sitting down, he looked across at me and he said, and it was really interesting that he felt he had to say this. He gestured towards me and he said, the House has learned to listen to the honourable gentleman, pointing at me, with respect when he talks about these issues. And the fact that he thought he had to say that showed me that we had made a little bit of progress, because he was no longer able to talk about LGBT people in a broad generalisation, because there, sitting in front of him, was one of these people he was talking about. I was really worried about what would happen locally about this decision I'd made to come out. And the following Friday, after I had made the speech in Rugby, the Islington Gazette came out. It came out every week. It was read by 20,000 people across my constituency. Now, remember, I had a majority of 363 votes. The front page of the Islington Gazette that Friday, banner headline, "I'm gay, says MP," next to the worst photograph they've ever published of me. That evening I was due to be doing a constituency surgery with 20, 30 different constituents coming in to see me about all their problems. And the really interesting thing was, even though the Islington Gazette had come out with their banner headline that morning, not a single person in my constituency surgery that evening mentioned anything about it. Then roll on a few years and we get to the 1987 general election. Now remember, I'm defending a majority of 363 votes. The then Social Democrats, now part of the Liberal Democrats, were the second placed people. And it was their top target seat in the entire country. They threw absolutely everything at the campaign. They bussed people in from all over the country. And really interestingly, the Tories in that local campaign, even though they were running quite a viciously homophobic campaign nationally, there had been a big media furore about a book that had been discovered in an Islington Teachers' Centre called Jenny Lives with Eric and Martin. It was a rather lovely book from Denmark, I think it came, about a little girl growing up with two gay male parents. There was one copy of this book in a teacher's resource centre. It had, of course, to be Islington. The tabloid press went berserk about this. So the Tories in that 1987 election campaign had a big poster, which they put up around the country, with a photograph of the book, Jenny Lives with Eric and Martin, and beside it the legend, Labour's education policy. So nationally, the Tories were waging a pretty homophobic campaign. Locally, they didn't say a word about it. They were absolutely model opponents. The SDP, however, even though nationally they had very good policy on LGBT rights, locally they were using this on doorsteps everywhere. You don't want to vote for him, he's gay. And I can remember we trained our canvassers as to, if this issue came up on a doorstep, the lines that they had to use. Line number 1, isn't it good to have an MP who's honest for a change? Line number 2, but you know that Chris Smith works for everyone, no matter who or what they are. Line number 3, if neither line 1 nor line 2 worked, you don't mean to tell me you're prejudiced, do you? And interestingly, in the entire campaign, no one had to get to line 3. By the time, and my majority went up, didn't go up by much. Instead of 363, it became 805. Subsequently, I got it up to 15,000. And by that time, everyone locally regarded the entire issue as old hat. It was just not something that anyone thought was important. We know all about that. They weren't interested in it being raised. After a few years, of course, we got to 1997 and the Labour landslide victory and the new Tony Blair government. And I was appointed to the Cabinet as Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport. And I'm pretty sure that I was the first openly gay cabinet minister to be appointed anywhere in the world. There have now been 1 or 2 since, and there's been an openly lesbian Prime Minister of Iceland as well. But at the time, I was the first. And the wonderful thing was that no one noticed. And that told me that we had made a huge amount of progress, because it had ceased to be a big thing. And that is how I hope we make some progress on this issue. And then that government was able to bring in a whole raft of legislative change. We equalised the age of consent. Immediately prior to that election, the age of consent for straight couples was 16. The age of consent for gay male couples was 18, and the law did not recognise that lesbians existed. This, I gather, was down to Queen Victoria, but we equalised the age of consent, and that was the first and most important step, because it was fundamentally about equality. And it's fair to say Tony Blair himself, as Prime Minister, was initially very hesitant about doing it. There were a number of us arguing quite strongly within the Cabinet and his circle that this was something that the new government should do. He was worried, and his office were worried. They were saying things like, oh, what are our pensioner voters going to think about us? I might actually say exactly the same to Rachel Reeves at the moment. We finally got him to agree that if we could get a case taken to the European Court, and if the European Court found against the UK government, he could then claim that he was being forced to do it, and he would introduce legislation. And that is precisely what happened. A very brave young couple, assisted by Stonewall, took a case to the European Court. They won the case. The court found against the British government, and Tony Blair then was as good as his word, and he introduced legislation to equalise the age of consent. And he did more than that, because it got very happily through the House of Commons, but then the House of Lords blocked it. And he then invoked the Parliament Act in order to override the House of Lords. And that is seldom done in Britain, but he did it in order to make sure that the equal age of consent could be legislated for. And of course, what happened was there was no revolt of the pensioners, there was no adverse impact on Labour's standing with the electorate. Everyone was rather pleased that this had happened. And after that, everything else that we were able to do, getting rid of Section 28, equal access to goods and services for everyone, and then civil partnerships. Everything else we were able to do was easy and had full support from the then Prime Minister. Now, we have made a huge amount of progress since those days, and the subsequent Conservative government built on the civil partnerships in order to establish equal marriage. And all credit to David Cameron, it was the one good thing he did as Prime Minister. All credit to him for bringing equal marriage in. It's still the case, however, that more Labour MPs voted for equal marriage than Conservative MPs did. I would not have been able to say this 10 years before, but the House of Lords voted more decisively for equal marriage than the House of Commons did. The House of Lords had learned its lessons and had transformed itself over the previous 10 years. Now, in all of this progress, we need to remember that we still haven't done everything. There is still bullying goes on in schools. There are still schools where teaching about equality is regarded as anathema by many parents whose kids are at the school. The Church of England still will not celebrate and recognise gay partnerships. This is before we get to the need to prohibit conversion therapy and the need to make some rather better progress on trans rights than we have yet seen. So there's still a lot of stuff to be done, but we have made enormous progress. There is even more stuff to be done around the rest of the world. In many Commonwealth countries, there are legacies from British colonial times of really viciously homophobic legislation. There are still countries around the world where homosexuality is punishable by the death penalty, and certainly there are many countries where it is a criminal offence. We can't and shouldn't preach to those countries as a Western democracy, but what we can do is help to support people within those countries who are fighting for their rights and for the equality which they deserve. In all of these things, I think we go on a spectrum. We start with fear of difference and the prejudice and hostility that that gives rise to. We then move to something that you might call tolerance. And we then move to something that you might call acceptance. And we then ought to be able to move to something that you might call celebration. A celebration of the richness that comes to society from embracing and welcoming difference amongst everyone within a society. In this country, I think we're probably somewhere around, for LGB, not for T yet, but for LGB, we are somewhere around the acceptance point. We still haven't got to celebration, unless you happen to live in Brighton. We have made a lot of progress. We still need to make more. But elsewhere around the world, we're still at the bottom of the spectrum. We're nowhere near the top. And we desperately need to make more progress elsewhere around the world. We will get there because it's right and it's important and it helps to cement a society together, and it helps ultimately to make a society more prosperous and more at ease with itself. It will happen, I'm sure, but how long? Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, very much. So I just wanted to say what a remarkable story that is. And speaking out is never easy, is it? So congratulations. But I just asking the question about what is it in society that really drives change? So legislative reform is important, but it's not enough, is it? So what else was happening that made those kinds of changes possible at that particular moment in the United Kingdom? And what might make those changes possible elsewhere in the world now as we look at it? If you go very quick comparative discussion.
I think the key to it wasn't the leaders, it wasn't the politicians, it wasn't even the prominent actors and sports people who were coming out. I think it happened because ordinary people in their neighbourhood, in their family, amongst their friends, in their workplace, simply had the courage to talk about themselves and to say, yes, I am. And that fundamentally changed a lot of people's attitudes. It became something normal, accepted. And that then, I think the people were way ahead of the politicians in this. There was a fundamental change in how society viewed all of this, and the politicians followed on after that.
Yes, interesting. But I'm also very interested in and sometimes a little bit surprised as to why gender and sexuality are back on the political agenda and so important in contemporary politics. So if we just take, for example, Uganda, which is a very difficult situation. Now, in Uganda there's been recent legislation on this matter, which has reintroduced the death penalty actually. But then, on top of that, the public discussion in Uganda has been strongly influenced by populist right-wing figures from the United States. And so there's a sort of crossover process that's going on in that political space, which almost feels sometimes like we're going backwards a little bit. How do you feel about that?
One of the lessons of the last few years is that you can never rest on your laurels. You can never assume that that's it done, because you are constantly having to fight against attempts to roll it back.
Yeah.
And you can see that happening in both here in the UK and in a more extreme fashion in the US. There are some states in the US, Florida for example, which are now introducing the equivalent of Section 28 that we had got rid of here. And here there are some political figures who are they're certainly using trans rights.
Yes.
They are using, in some cases, even lesbian and gay rights as a weapon in what they believe is a culture war that will help to bring working class voters to their cause. Yeah. I think they're mistaken in that because I'm pretty confident in the good sense and generosity of most ordinary people, that they're not going to follow a culture warrior, but it is being used.
Yes. And that links to the whole question, of course, of the rise of of populist politics and the undermining of various kinds of versions of solidarity that could give rise to more flourishing forms of prosperity. And it's the way that certain kinds of pressures in modern society connect to others. So whilst on the one hand we're fighting for trans rights, we're also having to combat rising levels of sexual violence against women and increasing levels of denigration of other people in our communities, so Muslim members of our communities and others. So this focus on difference. So from thinking about it as you do now, do you think if you'd had social media in the time when you were pushing this stuff through Parliament, what would you have done there, do you think?
Social media makes everything more difficult. you have only to look at the way in which under Elon Musk, X, the social media formerly known as Twitter, was used in order to stoke up anti-Muslim sentiment, anti-migrant sentiment, leading to the riots that we saw back in the summer. You only have to look at that to recognise how really perverse the impact of social media can be.
Yeah.
Now, the answer is not to close down the whole of social media.
No.
The answer has to be learning how to make social media work for the good rather than for the evil.
Yeah.
And we're not terribly good at that.
No, and I think we should definitely do more. We'll follow up on that point. Now, we have microphones around the room, so let's take a few questions, and you have to wave at me if I can't really see where you are. And don't be shy. This is a new group of people, so they're a little bit shy about things. There's one here.
Thank you very much for that. I was interested in this, the way you were describing change. You were saying that normal people, average people are maybe far ahead of politicians oftentimes, but I was interested in whether you could maybe reflect a bit more on that interplay. Also, when certain legislation is passed, how that might change wider perceptions, normalize things that weren't considered normal before. You mentioned, I was really grateful that you mentioned trans rights several times. I think in the UK, along with the US, it's probably much more of an issue in the culture wars than in other countries, definitely in Europe. Yeah, I was interested in why you think that is and how you see that changing, perhaps with the new government as well.
I think I'm certainly absolutely sure that people were ahead of the politicians back in the mid-1990s on this whole area of policy. But there is a bit of a chicken and egg. The social attitudes shape what politicians feel confident enough to do, but legislative change brought in by politicians can help in turn to shape and to reassure ordinary people. And at its worst, politics in right-wing populist forms can pretend to be answering people's frustrations and problems, whilst actually, in some cases, doing precisely the reverse. And populism can use all sorts of levers of hatred of difference and of the other in order to stoke up what they see as support. And we need to find better ways of countering that. Because trying rationality very often doesn't work. Just to give you a completely different example, one of the very worst things that has happened in this country in my entire lifetime was the decision for Brexit. The problem during the referendum campaign that led up to Brexit was that the Leave campaign were talking to people's hearts, the Remain campaign were talking to people's heads. And in that contest, you are never going to win the rational argument. There was a wonderful, I love the stuff that Led by Donkeys have been doing on social media. And there was a wonderful film on the day that Britain finally left the EU, so the end of January 2020. Led by Donkeys did this wonderful film, and they projected it on the White Cliffs of Dover. And it was 2 World War II veterans sitting in wheelchairs, bedecked with medals. And one of them looked at the camera and said, "The European Union, this is the peace we fought for." And I just thought at that moment, if only the Remain campaign had done that during the referendum campaign, the result might have been different. You cannot answer populism by talking rationally. You need to speak equally to people's emotions.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I was curious, given your long years of experience, how you approach the issue of pinkwashing. So for maybe our students who aren't familiar, the use of something like say celebration, or you might argue it's a sort of bastardisation and celebration of gay rights to advance other inequalities. So we think of this in terms of settler colonialism in Israel, corporate exploitation in various global contexts. And so, in a sense, it's a question coming back to what Henrietta asked about how different inequalities intersect and how we deal with that in the present.
I would just make an aside, first of all, because this question of different inequalities intersecting is really difficult. And I do find myself sometimes with my friends who are trans rights activists and my friends who are feminists wanting to bang their heads together and say, for God's sake, you are on the same side. Because these are, by and large, artificial distinctions that other people have tried to create. But the pinkwashing thing, it's very evident each year in the celebration of Pride in London. Huge numbers of corporate floats and corporate sponsorship and companies wanting to leap on the spending power of the pink pound. I'm torn between thinking this is a bastardization of principle, and on the other hand, thinking let's grab all the corporate money if we possibly can and use it to good purpose. I think probably, provided that you don't have to undermine your principles in accepting it, I would go for grabbing the money and doing good with it.
Yes, please, here.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting. And my question is, what is your personal view when it comes to engaging with countries or groups that are virulent navigation?
Oh, very difficult. I remember I went out to Swaziland and South Africa to talk about the response that they were making to HIV. And at the time, South Africa was, the government of South Africa was saying that AIDS is not caused by HIV, it's, and they weren't making antiretrovirals available to anyone. It was really only Médecins Sans Frontières who were. And Swaziland, where something like 40% of the entire adult population had HIV. Swaziland were just not making any medical response at all. Now, in those circumstances, I was absolutely sure that the world had to engage with them on those issues. Much more difficult when you're thinking about Uganda and their legislation on LGBT activity, where you're thinking about all the other places around the world, from Russia to Jamaica, that criminalize LGBT, criminalize people just for being LGBT. Should you cut them off? Probably not. But you need to be very careful about how you try and talk with them about some of these issues. I think much more powerful to support local activists who are trying to change from within, that's something that there are a number of really wonderful organisations like Kaleidoscope and the Human Dignity Trust who do, what we can't do is go to the government of Uganda as the government of the UK and tell them you're wrong. That won't change anything.
Yeah, yeah.
Thanks very much. Tony Blair from IGP. Just building on that, and it's not a question I thought I would be asking in the seminar, but I'll ask you anyway. If it comes down to it, isn't it incumbent upon countries like the UK to say to people who are in those countries, we would welcome you if you wanted to leave, if your life is at stake? Because living on the borders of Kenya, you see a lot of people now just leaving Uganda, really, and seeking to have some kind of life, even though Kenya is not necessarily proclaiming itself as a welcoming country with that flag. Isn't that something that could also be used politically to help people in the countries? Because otherwise, there's local groups will be persecuted and they will be eliminated. I'm just curious what your thoughts would be.
It could indeed, and it is an entirely legitimate ground for seeking asylum in the UK if you fear for your life, your mental well-being, and your ability to love someone whom you want to love in the country that you're fleeing from. And indeed we tried in the House of Lords when we were having all the debates on the wretched Rwanda bill. We tried to introduce an amendment to make an exception for people who were fleeing persecution because of their sexual orientation. It didn't get anywhere, I'm afraid, but the attempt was there.
Okay, more questions? Yes, at the back, please, too.
Thanks for that. I would like to follow up on Chris's question about pinkwashing, and also go back to something you said earlier about the sequence of, I think it was fear of difference, and then tolerance, acceptance, and celebration. So if celebration clearly isn't about the spectacle of commodification that we see in the corporate world and so forth, then what does it look like? What does celebration of difference and diversity look like without it being reduced to a sort of capitalist commodified spectacle?
Very interesting question. First of all, I would say I actually welcome the fact that companies are frequently advertising with same-sex couples in the advert, because that's the sort of thing which helps to change public attitudes. I remember I was chairman of the Advertising Standards Authority for 10 years. And we did a series of workshops in schools in Cardiff with 5th and 6th formers. And we showed them a series of ads and got the kids talking about what their views of the content of the ads were. One of the schools we went to was a Catholic girls' school. And one of the ads that we had decided we were going to show to the various schools was an ad for Hellmann's mayonnaise, which had a family with 2 dads, and all the kids were running around and packing their satchels to go to school, and one of the dads was heading off to the office in his car, and the other one was making the sandwiches for everyone using, of course, Hellmann's mayonnaise. And the climax of the ad is that after the sandwiches are all made and the man is heading off to his car to go to the office, the 2 men kiss, and up comes the legend, "It has to be Hellmann's." We were really worried, should we show this ad to the Catholic girls' school? These were 15 and 16-year-olds. Their teachers were all round the walls of the room. And we thought, what the hell? We're showing this to every other school. We're going to show it in this school. And we showed the ad. What the kids were really worried about, they had no problem whatsoever with the fact that 2 men were kissing. The thing they were really worried about was the stereotyping of the mum figure who stayed at home whilst the other one went out to work. That revealed a very intelligent approach to the advertising. So I think there is some pinkwashing in advertising that I'm actually very happy to see there. But what else can happen in order to bring us to celebration? Total absence of fear and discrimination, and a sense that it doesn't matter how different you are or what you happen to be, but you are totally, completely accepted by everyone around you in every organisation that you are a part of. In some ways, the best way of celebrating is if it has totally ceased to be an issue. So celebration may, at its very best, be a complete absence of any sense of difference at all.
Following on that, actually I have another question, but following on that, I also find problematic the whole idea of celebration. I mean, I think pride is framed in terms of antithesis to shame, being shamed because of the diversity somehow. And there is some very interesting literature on this by feminist scholars. I'm thinking of Elspeth Robin, Blush, Faces of Shame, or Sarah Ahmed, who have written on it. But I'm thinking, if there is another language that has to be found, probably your conclusion before makes me think of that. You know, the language that is not so much celebration or acceptance as a step forward to tolerance. Because in the end, Section 28 was actually framed also in terms of an accusation of the possibility of teaching and promoting the acceptability of homosexuality as a pretended family creation. Okay? So maybe my question is more being Italian actually, and coming from a country in which homosexuality was never criminalized, but as a matter of fact, many people, many scholars would say that probably from the point of view of gay rights or LGBTQ rights is way behind the UK. I'm thinking of what are your thoughts about this interconnectedness or the interplay between the legal aspect of criminalization and specific cultural, religious dimensions in the UK specifically, but also in other countries. I mean, how, if you have, I mean, somebody could say that if an act is criminalized, in the end there's something to fight for, to decriminalize it. While if the culture, if the dominant mainstream culture and religion comes into it, is affirming that homosexuality or other, you know, other elements are not, are not acceptable in the end. And you see the Italian government at the moment is actually often arguing for that. You know, what are your thoughts on that? Because if the cultural religious element together, or vis-a-vis the legal element. And on the other hand, on the language, I mean, how can we find a new language somehow?
Culture and religion, of course, play a huge part in determining the attitudes of society, and also in some countries, not so much here in this country, in some countries shaping the actions of politicians. There are, however, some really spectacularly good examples of how that can be overcome. And the most obvious is Ireland. Deeply Catholic country, the Catholic Church setting its face very firmly against gay marriage. They had a referendum, 65% of Ireland voted in support of gay marriage in the teeth of opposition from the Catholic Church. So it is possible to overcome some of these cultural assumptions that derive from, very often derive from religion. It is possible to do it, especially when young people get mobilized. because there is certainly an age difference in views on all of this. Young people overwhelmingly much more prepared to embrace difference than their older generations.
Now, I think we've had a wonderful discussion. I would take one more if there was one more, otherwise we will close. I can't keep an eye open. No? Well, thank you, Chris, very much for a wonderful, wonderful talk. And now we're going to go to a party, so please, as I say, follow the IGP staff so you know where to go. But first of all, before we do that, please join me in thanking Chris Smith for a wonderful talk.